So while Breton nationalism is probably the most famous example of a regional nationalist movement in France in the 20th century, it certainly wasn't the only one, and actually in recent years it's definitely not the most vibrant one. That honour falls to Corsica, that there has been a significant growth of Corsican nationalism over the last 30 or 40 years, and unlike Breton nationalism, it actually has had a significant impact on local elections in Corsica as well. Corsica, let's talk a little bit about the history of Corsica. Traditionally, Corsica was considered part of, I guess, the wider geographic region of Italy. The language spoken in Corsican was Italian, or a dialect of Italian. I mean, Corsican to this day is considered basically a dialect of the Florentine dialect of Italian. For most of the medieval period, Corsica had been ruled by the various Italian city-states, in particular by Genoa. So Corsica had been controlled by Genoa for centuries. But in the middle of the 18th century, inspired by the Enlightenment, there was actually a rebellion in Corsica against Genoese rule, led by this guy here, Pascal Paoli. And again, you can see from the name itself, these names obviously sound more Italian than French. And in 1755, Paoli helped successfully establish an independent Corsican republic. That is, the Corsicans drove out the Genoese and established their own republic with their own constitution. They adopted as their flag, this is the Moor's Head, which is still the flag of Corsica today. It seems to be based on an older Aragonese banner that traditionally had 4 Moorish heads, which was supposed to symbolise the Muslim princes that had been conquered by the Crown of Aragon during the time of the Reconquista, and so that's what the legacy is in the Corsican flag today. Actually, traditionally the bandana was over the eyes of the Moor's head, but Paoli insisted that the bandana be raised to symbolise the kind of enlightenment and the liberation of the Corsican people. So for about 12 or 13 years, there was an independent Corsican republic in the Mediterranean. The Genoese realised they would never be able to reconquer Corsica themselves. They were too weak. So they decided to sell their stake in Corsica to the French. And in 1768, the French then invaded Corsica to make good on the claim and to claim Corsica for the French crown. And amongst the people who resisted the French invasion was the father of Napoleon Bonaparte. And obviously we talked a little bit about Bonaparte's connections with Corsica as well. But he originally, as a youth, was quite an ardent Corsican nationalist himself. It was only after he was sent to France for schooling and he was able to advance his way through the French imperial system that he began to change his attitude towards Corsican independence. And of course, the success of Napoleon, in particular, becoming Emperor of France, consolidated the relationship between Corsica and France. And for much of the first half of the 19th century, there wasn't really any strong sense of Corsican independence. Many of the elite or the nobles in Corsican society, like Bonaparte himself, whose family were minor nobles in Corsica, followed his lead basically and tried to establish careers serving the French state. The kind of first real story of Corsican nationalism was kind of connected with, again, linguistic affairs, that the French state tried to discourage use of Corsican. So this is a school sign, the rules of the school. So the first rule is don't speak Corsican and don't spit on the floor. And I think in many ways, not just banning the spitting or not just banning the Corsican language in the schools, but of course equating it in some ways to spitting on the floor as a kind of bad habit that needed to be discouraged. Began to have an effect on the Corsican language, and over the course of the 19th century, there were more and more families starting to switch to speaking French as their first language, and that kind of provoked concern among some Corsican nationalists that more needed to be done to preserve the island's distinct linguistic heritage and culture. So in 1914, a Corsican nationalist journal was established, CISPRA, and you can see here in its first editorial in March 1914, it said, Corsica is not a French department, but a defeated nation that will be reborn, and kind of advocating for a renewal, essentially, of Corsican independence. However, the Corsican independence movement was pretty small in the first half of the 20th century, and one reason for this was that many Corsicans received employment through the French state, in particular through the empire. It's estimated that Corsica made up less than 1% of the population of France, but 20% of the bureaucrats who administered the French Empire were from Corsica. So clearly it was a very important source of employment for many in Corsica, and it seemed to bind Corsica more closely to France. In some ways, you might draw a parallel, if you guys are interested, with Scottish nationalism, that Scottish nationalists were disproportionately represented in the bureaucracy of the British Empire, and some people have noticed that it wasn't until the decline of the British Empire in the second half of the 20th century that Scottish nationalism began to emerge as a political force, and certainly you could say there's something kind of similar happens in Corsica, because as we already talked about, in the second half of the 20th century, this is the French Empire collapsing and disappearing. As the empire collapsed and disappeared, many of those jobs dried up, and so some of the kind of financial loyalty that some Corsicans had to the French state was no longer in place. Perhaps a more important aspect of the collapse of the French state for Corsican nationalism were the Pieds Noirs. We've talked about before, the Blackfeet, that is the people of European descent living in Algeria, many of whom were forced to flee Algeria after the Algerian independence in 1962. I think I mentioned there was something along the lines of about 800,000 Pieds Noirs flee Algeria, go to France, and the French government tries to settle them in Corsica. It believes that there's a lot of land in Corsica, and that would be the best place to put them. They don't really consult the local Corsicans in any kind of way, and to a lot of Corsicans, it kind of looks like that what the French are really trying to do is to plant settlers, engage essentially in colonial colonization or settler colonization of Corsica in order to keep it loyal to the French state. So that annoys a lot of people in Corsica. It also, of course, starts to increase the price of houses in Corsica as more and more people are being shipped to Corsica to try and acquire this land. And what this led to was, let me just get this here, in 1971, a guy called Edmond Simeoni, pictured here on, so Simeoni is the guy on the left, established Action Regionaliste Corsa, the Corsican Regional Action Movement, and in particular they were demanding that the French give greater local political autonomy, maybe not necessarily full independence, but local political autonomy to Corsica, so that Corsica never again would have to find itself dealing with an influx of outsiders who were dropped upon them without their kind of consent. But the French state largely ignores the Action Regionaliste course. And in 1975, Simoni ups the stakes, and him and an armed group of Corsican nationalists seize hold of a building. You see here, this is Simeoni being interviewed, seize hold of a building in Corsica in kind of defiance of the French state, and kind of challenging the French state basically to come and deal with them because they're demanding political autonomy for Corsica. This led to a conflict between, so the French state sent in 2,000 policemen to deal with the Corsicans, and there was actually a gunfight broke out. 2 police officers were killed. Many of the Corsicans were arrested, were put on trial, and during the trial of the Corsicans, there were more riots in the city of Ajaccio. Ajaccio is the main city of Corsica, and essentially this was the beginning of a Corsican independence movement, a paramilitary effort to establish Corsican independence. The group responsible for this, and so we're seeing kind of echoes of what we saw in Brittany, was the emergence of a revolutionary nationalist armed movement in the 1970s, the Front Liberation Nationale, of course, the Corsican National Liberation Front. Unlike the Bretons, the Corsicans were not really as skittish about taking human life. There wasn't necessarily wholesale slaughter, but they weren't afraid to kill people in the course of their campaign in the same way the Breton nationalists tried to avoid. In the peak of the Corsican Liberation Front, National Liberation Front, was in late 70s, early 80s. In 1979, for example, in the first 3 months of 1979, they detonated over 150 explosives across Corsica. They were also very influenced by the Provisional IRA, who in the 1970s were waging their own campaign against the British state in Northern Ireland. The Provisional IRA eventually began carrying out bombing attacks in Britain itself, and their logic was that they wanted to make the British public more aware of the conflict in Northern Ireland. the Corsican National Liberation Front decided to copy this tactic and begin carrying out attacks in France as well, as a way of drawing attention to their cause. And so on May 6, 1979, the Corsicans detonated 20 different explosives at various banks across Paris. And so over the next couple of years, they begin carrying out terrorist attacks in Paris as well. Although the movement, eventually the French state is able to track down many of the leaders. So the campaign continues. There is a ceasefire in 1988 for a short period of time, but eventually the Corsican Liberation Front resumes its campaign, but never quite with the same intensity that it had in terms of its campaign of the early 1980s. However, the most notorious action carried out by the Corsican National Liberation Front was the assassination in 1998 of Claude Erignac, who was the leading French official on the island of Corsica, the French prefect on Corsica. He was murdered outside his apartment. And while the Corsican National Liberation Front denied involvement, it was widely kind of believed or widely acknowledged that they were, and this produced a backlash against the organisation. Nevertheless, it continued to carry out attacks in Corsica. In particular, over the course of the late 20th, early 21st century, it began attacking French people who were buying holiday homes in Corsica. Corsica is obviously a very beautiful island. Its Mediterranean location made it attractive for French people who wanted a holiday home or a second home in Corsica. This, of course, served to drive up the price of real estate in Corsica. And so this was one example of a French banker who in 2012 found himself confronted in his house by Corsican nationalists who ordered him out of the house, who destroyed his car and destroyed his house as well. Finally, in 2014, the Corsican National Liberation Front called a ceasefire. And so since then, kind of the political military campaign of Corsican nationalists has been stilled, but there has been a growing political campaign instead. So in 2000, the French state decided to give a referendum to Corsica, not for independence, but whether Corsica wanted greater regional autonomy. And you see the vote here. Actually, Corsica, by a slim majority, 51% voted against extending the powers of the Corsican Parliament. But this seems to have kick-started or renewed the energy of the Corsican nationalist agenda. One party that was established in 2003 was the National Party of Corsica. That was the left-leaning party that was dedicated towards not full independence but autonomy for Corsica. There was also the Corsa Libre party established a couple of years afterwards that was aimed for full independence for Corsica. And in 2015, a new party, Corsica, the Corsican Party, was established by Gilles Simoni, who was the son of Edmond Simoni, the guy who started the kind of Corsican nationalist movement in the 1970s. The guy pictured on the right is Jean-Guy Talamoni, who was the leader of the Corsa Libre Party, the Free Corsica Party. So the PAE Corsica under Simoni is a regionalist party. It just wants greater autonomy for Corsica. Talamoni's party wants political independence. However, in 2014, after the ceasefire of the Corsican National Liberation Front, the two parties agreed a deal that they would work together for 10 years to try and advance the cause of Corsican nationalism more generally. And in the 2015 election, they had enormous success. They won a majority of the seats in the Corsican Parliament, and since then they've maintained very strong results in local Corsican elections. Talamoni is advocating that this is a sign that there's a growing independence movement in Corsica. Gilles Simoni is more cautious in saying this is about Corsican. We don't want independence as such. So there's actually a division amongst the Corsican nationalists themselves about what exactly they're looking for in terms of their long-term goals. So Simoni's party is content with regional autonomy. Talamoni's party wants political independence, but combined they are a majority in the Corsican Parliament. Their three main demands are: one, greater recognition of the Corsican language, in fact equality for the Corsican language in Corsica with French, that could be used in all official capacities, for the Corsican Assembly to have greater control over stopping people coming to Corsica, outsiders buying houses in Corsica. And the third demand is that people who are involved with the political terrorist movement, the Corsican National Liberation Front, be freed from jail because now that the campaign has a ceasefire. Up until this point, the French state has been very adamant it will not compromise and give Corsican language official status. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens going forward, because the French state is in a kind of a position that maybe something akin to what the French state found itself in Catalonia, that if it denies these kind of linguistic rights, it encourages nationalism, but if it gives into these linguistic demands, it also encourages nationalism. So it's going to be interesting over the next couple of decades to see whether the Corsican national movement, and it has the potential to do so, gains the same kind of credibility that the Scottish or Catalonian nationalist movements have had